Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is Liege in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 36, The Goddess Rite of Rebirth. The bells of the monastery rung so loudly and lively as it greets every single visitors it receives within its ancient and strong walls. It doesn't matter if one is old or young, a commoner or a noble, all it matters is that this is a day where everyone will celebrate this day as equal as they prayed for the blessing of the goddess and for her to return and guide them in this mortal plains. But now, I'm bored. Suthies shouted from the pendant around her neck as she shakes in annoyance. The knights told us to stay put, so, she said before sipping her tea. Well, they already checked. Suthies said, it's not like we are in immediate danger anyway, she said. But we still need to make sure the area around the monastery is safe, she said. Suthies let out a huff. Fine, she said. She smiled as she brought the tea back to her lips. I'm bored. Suthies said. Did something happen, Your Grace? Dimitri asked. Right, she said as she turned her attention on Dimitri, a town below Garag was, she said, trying to find a word to put it nicely as to not trigger Dimitri's trauma, was destroyed last night, she said. Dimitri's eye widened as soon as she said that. Did anyone survived? He asked. None, she said. Everything got consumed by the fire and all that remained is the charred remain of what's once a lively town, she said. Did you know who did it? Dimitri asked as he clenched his fist. Unfortunately, no. She said. The knights are still investigating the matter, she said, and so far, the only thing that is found in the scene is half-eaten and charred bodies and some even missing their other halves, she said. Did you think of a purpose? Dimitri asked. None, she said, but I know there is a reason for this attack, she said. Maybe a way to snuff you out. Suthies asked. Or a way to send a very threatening message to me, she muttered, and further proof of that is the attack the night before the goddess rite of rebirth, she said. The holy mausoleum, Dimitri said. She nods at that. That's why I'm requesting an extra security inside and out of the monastery, she said. Dimitri is about to say something when the door to the balcony of her quarters opened and a familiar footsteps can be heard nearing her, making her smile. Your Grace, she said with a bow. I have returned, he said. Welcome home, she said as she gave him a smile. Thank you, Your Grace, she said. I hope you are well, she said, trying to see if he is fine or tired or unwell. I'm, Your Grace, she said, and I have come to give you a report in regards of the investigation, he said. Go on, she said as she turned her full attention towards the purple-haired knight. It seems like they found traces of a bird claw on the ground, she said. Bird? She asked. Just one? She asked in confusion. A big one if anything, she said. So, a monster bird? She asked. That breathes fire? She asked, trying to remember if they ever encounter a beast that is a bird and breathes fire. A Nabatean? She asked. Impossible, Suthies said. How so? She asked. Us Nabateans breathes fire, Grandmama, she said. Not every Nabatean, Suthies said, except you and my little Ceros, she said. Ah, yes. That time when she managed to contract a fever that her Nabatean blood must have been even more active. That time that every time she sneezed, she managed to spit a fireball, not spitball. No wonder she is worried about her being sick. She managed to spend all her divine pulse that day, since she either managed to set his hair on fire or his clothes on fire, so, yeah, that explains why she is so worried about her health. What do you mean, Suthies? She asked. Each Nabatean have their own elements and each elements are inherited by their offsprings, Suthies said. Take Sikal for example, she said. If I recall, she said, Saint Sikal's sire is the Grim Dragon, she said as she looked at Dimitri. That's where his strength comes from, and his mother is a light dragon. Thus, FL Saint Sethleen's affinity is a light dragon, right? She said. That's right, Suthies said, and the same goes for Ceros and you who inherited my affinity for fire since you two are halflings. You and my little Ceros shared the same affinity, she said. Still confusing though, she said. You'll learn, Suthies said with a chuckle. I hope so, she said. So, not a giant bird or a Nabatean, she said. It could be another one of those Slither, she said. Slitherer? Dimitri asked. She took a deep breath. The last thing she wanted is to drag Dimitri into this mess with the Agarthants. That is the reason why she kept the King of Fodlan and the rest of her students away from this conflict, saved for Happy, and Happy isn't even that involved. She is mainly used for information for those who slithers in the dark. One war is more than enough for all of them. She isn't about to drag everyone to fight in this secret war that went on for almost 4 millennia, and that also includes her knights. Her eyes went towards Shay and her heart squeezed tightly in her chest. Did she somehow drag an innocent bystander into her own mess? One that have a potential desire to. She felt Shay squeeze her shoulders, taking her out of her reverie. She responded by putting her hand over his before giving it a gentle squeeze back. Right, she said as she turned her attention back to Dimitri. I want you to calm yourself, Mitya, she said. I'm calm, Your Grace, Dimitri said. She nods at this. Those who slithers in the dark is the ones who orchestrated your family's murder, she said. Further investigation also lead to some of the co-conspirator in the tragedy of Dusker, she said, including your uncle and some of the noble houses that supported his claim to the throne. Your throne, she added. Dimitri took a deep breath. I always have a hunch that my uncle have some level of involvement with the tragedy of Dusker, but I always pray to the fates that it was just rumors, he said. I'm so sorry, Dimitri, she said, for interfering in your affairs, she said. No. Dimitri said, I needed that, at the very least. I know where to look now, he said. Thank you, Your Grace, he said. It's my pleasure, Mitya, Byleth said. If I can help with getting rid of this threat then, Dimitri said. No, Mitya, she said. One war is enough, and I refused to let you die after everything I went through to keep you alive during the war. After Lord Rodrigue sacrificed himself for you, I refuse to let you join in this mess, she said. I won't die, Dimitri said as he stood up and walked towards her before kneeling and grabbing her hand. I swear to you, he said as he leaned his forehead to her hand. I won't die on you, Dimitri said ardently. For your sake and yours alone, I won't die, he said. That's why, he said. Let me fight by your side, Dimitri said. Let me lift the burden you are carrying and let me give your heart peace, he said. She said. I thank you, Mitya, she said, but I won't take you to battle. I want to keep you safe, she said. My beloved and most precious friend, she said softly. She saw Dimitri winced at that. But, Dimitri said, meeting her eyes. Shay is here, she said. Everything will be alright because Shay is going to fight by my side, she said as her chest tightened at the thought and doubt and fear started to cloud her mind. Would he still want to fight with you if he ever know that dash? The thought was cut off when she heard Shay's voice. No worries, Your Majesty, Shay said. I swear my life in her service, and I swear to protect her even if it costs my life, even if the world were to sneer at me, hate me, and punish me for it, he said softly. I will stay by her side, to protect and to keep safe until death shall claim my life, Shay said. My, Suthies said with a giggle. That sure sound like a wedding vow, Arvel said. I mean, Shay said blushing. She smiled at that as she felt her heart flutter. I know you want to spend an eternity with me, but, she said with a giggle, I didn't know you wanted to take it a step further towards marriage, she said with a laugh. I better look for a ring then, Shay said scratching his head. You know, before you beat me to it, he said as he smirked at her in triumph. She gave him a smirk back. No, Shay said in disbelief. You already have one, he asked. She nods as she sipped her already cold tea. Damn it! Shay exclaimed. Despite the exterior she is showing to Shay, she can't help but grimace at a certain memory she have, about the first time she met Shay in Arvel. Would he still think that way when he knew? That one question is enough for cold fear to grip her heart again. Would he still wanted to stay by my side if he knew about me? After what I've done back then? And that one thought is more than enough for despair and terror to take root inside her heart. Damn, Valerie! Said as she stood before the rubbles of the burnt village. If only, she said as she felt pain shot up her head. Big sis. Ignatz asked. I'm fine, Valerie. Said as she gripped her head when bloodied walls and screams of pain flashed into her memory and she is once again back inside that blood-stained castle. The cries for help of Nabateans and Agarthans alike can be heard as the sound of blade against flesh joined into the symphony of terror that haunts her over and over again. She about to retreat into her own mind when she felt warm hands out themselves on her shoulder. What? Valerie said. Come back to us, Miss Valerie, Raphael said softly. I'm fine, Valerie said as she took deep breaths to calm herself down. She said. Raphael and Ignatz just stood by her side as she catch her breath. Fine, she said as she started to focus on the task at hand. So, do you think this is the work of those guys from last time? Raphael asked as soon as he is sure that Valerie found her footing. Definitely, Valerie said as she saw the large claw marks that damned Heracles. Valerie said. Someone called my name. Heracles asked. Damn, Valerie muttered as she abruptly turned to face Heracles and his clients. Not now. Not now. She thought as she looked over towards both Ignatz and Raphael. Hello, beautiful slaughterer, Heracles greeted with a very wide grin. What opportunity and luck we have to find a very suitable tribute to signal the Archbishop of her death, he said as his eyes flashed a dangerous red. Valerie barely have time to react and grab both Ignatz and Raphael as she jumped to safety when a giant blade attached to a tail swung towards them, and it would have given them a painful death if she wasn't fast enough to respond to the attack before she saw the fireball heading their way, and she quickly jumps out of the way as she attempts to bring Ignatz and Raphael to safety. Listen, you two, Valerie said as she landed. Go to Ethra, she said. But, Ignatz protest. Now is not the time to argue. Go. Valerie ordered as she pushed another fireball aside before she brought out a barrier in the last second, absorbing the next fireball before she threw it back towards Heracles. Go. She said as she saw Heracles dashing towards her in an ungodly speed with his claw-like hand at the ready. Roger. Raphael said before he grabs Ignatz and throwing him on his shoulder and make a run for it. Valerie managed to block Heracles' giant claws as she put out another barrier. Transform now and let us enjoy our fight as two beasts. Heracles said. Beautiful slaughterer, Valerie Helena Regnus. Heracles said in a manic bouts of bloodlust. Valerie let out a burst of energy, effectively making Heracles stagger, and saw her chance to run away from the man as he recovered. A fireball whizzed past her ears and several others hitting the ground near her. Are you a coward? Heracles shouted as she rolled away from the spikes that appeared from the grounds. How disappointing, he said with a growl as he landed in front of her in a shape of giant panther. No. Valerie said as she subtly looks for a way out when her eyes landed on a hole that leads to an underground sewage. Little Lady Ceros is quite a genius to improve the sewage system and modeling it after what her mother created back in Great Adrestia. I just merely know when not to fight. She said as a magic circle appeared in front of her, blinding light. She said as the spell activated and let out a big explosion of light that is enough to burn any normal human being. But Heracles smiled as his vision cleared. Isn't that new? He muttered. I expect you to come charging at me while I'm blinded, Heracles said as his arms transformed back to normal. Shame, he said. I was expecting to be able to impale you and send you to meet the rest of your family, he said. Are you done now, Heracles? Bias asked. Heracles scoffed. She escaped, he said. Well, that's disappointing, Bias said, I was hoping to send her head to the fell star but, she said shame, she said in disappointment before a grin appeared on her face. Oh well, let us begin, Bias said, and kill the archbishop and take the hero's relics back. She said as the whole of Okama Mountain was swallowed by the spell labyrinth. Byleth have been acting strangely since this morning and he can't help but worry about her. Something wrong, Your Grace? He asked as he watched Byleth fished. Why do you ask? Byleth. As she kept her eyes on her the water as he scooted closer to her before put one arm behind her and another behind him to support himself when he leaned back to relax. You have been acting weird since morning, he said while he sat beside Byleth as she fished. Am I? Byleth asked. Yes, he said. Is something bothering you, Your Grace? He asked in concern. Just thinking, Byleth said. No need to worry, Shay, she said. Are you sure? He asked, still not assured about her condition. I'm, Byleth said as she leaned on his chest. I just have something on my mind, she said as she let out a soft sigh of contentment. That's all she said. If you're sure, he said as he relaxes while Byleth leaned on him. The rite of rebirth will be beginning in a few hours and he have to make sure that the archbishop is in a top form in order to perform a service in the afternoon and the ceremony to lay the 11 centaurs to rest. But I'll carry you forcefully to your chambers if you start to feel unwell, he said. Byleth merely hummed. That sounds like a tempting offer, Sir Knight, she said with a soft laugh. I wasn't joking, he said. I know, Byleth said. Thank you for looking out for me, Shay, she said. It's my pleasure, Your Grace, he said. They are covered by a comfortable silence before. You two looks comfy, Edwin said blankly. Mind if we join you guys? He asked. Not at all, he said as he senses something wrong with the way Edwin talked to him. Sorry for the intrusion, Sir Shay, Sophia said. You are no bother at all, Miss Sophia, he said as he felt Byleth tensing upon hearing the other woman's voice before she sat upright and started to reel in her line. Fishing, I assume, Eddie? He asked with a smile. Indeed, Edwin said as his eyes went cold, but not for the fishes, no. He said. What? He asked. I want to say, Shay, Edwin said. You are quite a lady, Esmond, he stated. What did I do? He asked in confusion. Last night on my way to the chapel, Edwin said. Sophia flinched at that. I saw you and the archbishop acting like a couple should be acting, Edwin said. That's none of your business, Edwin, he said. None of my business. Edwin snapped. It is my business because you are too oblivious to your surroundings, too oblivious to the people that you might be hurting. He said. I thought you said that there is nothing going on between the two of you, but here you are acting as though you are her Grace's lover. Edwin said. Did you ever think about how Miss Sophia might be feeling whenever she saw the two of you together? Edwin asked. If this keeps up then he said. I said enough. Sophia snapped as she stood up. When I confided to you about cares and my woes, I never wanted you to bring them up to light for everyone to see, Sir Edwin. That is never my intention. She said before she run off. He kept quiet as he looks at his buddy's face and saw the hurt and the regret that come across his face, and he knew what he must do. Your Grace, he said. Yes. Byleth asked. Can you leave me and Eddie for now? He asked. Please. He added. Byleth nods before she silently stood up and leave. Actually, Edwin said as he looked down, it was Miss Sophia who saw you last time, he said. I see, he said. And she came and confided to me about it, Edwin said. I see, he said. So, it was Miss Sophia who saw us, he said. I just got so angry with you, Edwin said. I got so angry at the thought of you playing with Miss Sophia's heart and I lost my temper and lashed out at you, he said. No, it's okay, he said, but I never imagined the ever-calm and responsible Sir Eddie can lose his temper too, he said. I just find it funny, he said with a laugh. Yeah, Edwin said with a scratch of his head, that was a huge hubris on my part, he said with a chuckle. But tell me, Shay, Edwin said. What? He asked. Do you like the Archbishop? Edwin asked. Did we already discuss this matter? He asked. Yeah, we did, Edwin said. But he asked, and nudging him to continue. You never did give me a straight answer, Edwin said, so I don't know where your heart lays at the moment, he said. Was it with the Archbishop or was it with Miss Sophia? Edwin asked. He looked up the sky and thought. Why was Edwin so angry about him breaking Sophia's heart? No. There is no question asked on the matter when it was obvious. It's the same reason why he is so keen on shielding Byleth and staying by Byleth's side. But was that love? Was the desire of wanting to always see her happy, laughing and smiling from the very bottom of her heart, love? But he felt uneasy when that knight and that nobleman flirted with her, but when the king made his desire to fight and bring peace upon her heart, he felt happy, at ease even. But at the same time, he felt lonely. Was that also love? Wanting to see Byleth happy even if her happiness cannot be found with him can also be called love? If Edwin did love Sophia? No. That thought never sent any uneasiness nor any sense of sadness. He is just happy if those two did become a couple, unlike what he felt at the thought of Byleth being with someone else. Was that love? He heard Edwin adjusting to a more comfortable position when the whole area turned blue and the space around them become distorted and everything around them seemed to froze. What the desh, he said in surprise as the sky above suddenly disappeared and was replaced by a blue distorted space of sort. Is this a spell? Now, he said in shock. This is bad, Arvel said. I know, he said as he turned to leave. We'll continue this later, Eddie, he said to Frozen Man, but I better go and find her Grace, he said before running towards the Star Terrace. I hope she is there, he muttered. She panted as she ran through the crowd of people as she headed towards the garden. She is so pathetic. Even though Sir Eddie is just helping her, she lashed out to him out of frustration from not be able to say what is on her mind when it comes to Sir Shay. Even though all she wanted to be close to him, she is too scared since she knows that she can't come between the closeness between the Archbishop and Sir Shay. She too scared to ruin what she have with Shay that she can't say what she wanted to, but at this rate, she won't be able to close the distance between them and will always be in between of what if but. No, enough is enough. She won't run away anymore. She will face this head on and she will try to win over Shay, and she turned around and met the Archbishop's eyes. She will not lose to her. She will not lose to Byleth Eisner, the Archbishop of the Church of Ceros and all of Fodlan. Chapter 37, The Goddess Rite of Rebirth 2. As she walks towards the garden, she is lost in thought as earlier events keeps replaying in her mind. What is she doing? What is she doing thinking about it now? Why was Sophia Durstein so mad? What made her so mad? But she don't care what or whoever she is mad with or about. What bothers her is the feeling of something being inadvertently awoken inside Sophia Durstein. She felt that familiar pain her chest again. No. It wasn't pain. This feeling, yes. This feeling is unpleasantness. This murky feeling is unpleasantness. Why did she feel that way back then, when she knew that somehow Sophia Durstein have gained some sort of courage in her heart? She don't understand, but she doesn't like this. She doesn't like not knowing why. She heard someone sobbing in the garden and turned her head to see Sophia Durstein hunched over and crying. Right. If she doesn't know the answer to this question, then she can just ask Sophia Durstein. Sophia Durstein turned around to face her. She is frightening, she thought as she met determined brown orbs looking straight at her. You are not playing fair, Byleth Eisner, Sophia said calmly and angrily. What? She asked cautiously as the unease and the unpleasantness inside her heart continued to intensify. You love Sir Shay too, right? Sophia stated. Something about that statement seems to tug at her heartstrings, and she felt her heart beating rapidly inside her chest. Love? What I'm feeling towards Shay is love. She thought as Shay's smiling face appeared in her mind, making her heart long for him and making her heart feel uneasy for what Sophia Durstein is about to say. Yet you take everything for granted and act as though you don't love him, take being so close to him, to be able to touch and hold him in your arms whenever you like for granted, while here I'm dying to gain that for myself. Sophia said, and it's unfair. She shouted. Why do I have to be scolded by you about these things? She asked, feeling offended about the accusation of her taking Shay for granted when she knows she took care of him, watch over him in the best of her abilities. When you don't know anything about me and him, she said. Because I have the right to, Sophia said. She was taken aback by that and rendered her speechless, as she seems to know what is coming next. Because I, Sophia said. No. Don't say it, don't take him away, don't utter those words to him, don't take him away. Because Shay is her, only her. I love Sir Shay too. Sophia said. Shay is her one and only, he is her. Just what is she thinking? I love Shay. She thought as she put her hand over her heart. I love Shay, she thought at the realization. That is why I have decided that I have enough being subtle about my feelings for him, Sophia said. It's time to end this feelings of uncertainty and move forward, Sophia said. I've decided to close in the distance that stood between me and my happiness, Sophia said. She said. No. Stop, you can't. I'll confess to him, Sophia said determinedly. I'll tell him myself and we'll let him decide who he wanted to be with. She said. No. She shouted as she felt fear shroud her heart. Don't tell him. You can't tell him. She said. The thought of him leaving her side is far too painful to bear, let alone if it becomes a reality. Something about watching him happy with someone else makes her sick to her stomach, whether it was this nun or some other woman, something about that just makes her sick. I have the right to, Sophia said. You haven't confessed to him yet, right? She said. I don't care if you are the hero that guided King Dmitri to victory against the Empire or the Archbishop, she said. I won't lose to someone as cowardly as you, Sophia said. If that's what you want then, she said as she is growing even more agitated, then, I'll also dash, she said before everything froze and the sky become blue and distorted, and so does her surrounding frozen. She muttered as she looked around. A spell. She muttered before she felt rage rising inside her heart. She said as Suthi's power flared up, turning her hair and eyes back to their seafoam color. How dare you, you insolent fool? She shouted as she draws the sword of the Creator. How dare you get in my way? She shouted as she stabbed the ground between them with sword of the Creator. Wait here and I'll be right back. She said as she pointed her finger towards the frozen woman as pure white flames started to surround her. How can I lose to you when me and Shay shared far more than you could ever wish you could? She exclaimed. I'll confess to him and you'll see, she said as she grabs the sword of the Creator. Shay will choose me. She declared before she jumped as she sensed Shay heading towards the Star Terrace. Your Grace, Shay called out to her as soon as she is in his sight. She landed on front of him, still reeling in the rage she is feeling, otherwise, she might make a fatal mistake in battle. Her father taught her to be in control at all times, not to let her emotions take over her bearings or she might die in battle, and that's how she always did in battle. Discipline is what Gerald taught her, and discipline is a must in the battlefield. Is the enemy already inside the monastery? Shay asked in shock. And where did he get the idea that the enemy is already here when they barely made any appearance at all? You look angry, Your Grace, Shay said. Oh. She took a deep breath before she grabs Shay's hand to drag him over to the balcony. No. She said. I can sense them over here, she said as she stopped and looked over the horizon. So, this is a massive spell? Shay asked. That's right, she said, and whoever cast this might have been preparing for the day of the goddess right of rebirth to arrive, she said, but why now in all of those years that they decided to launch this attack on Gareg Mach? She asked. Not when but what made them do it, Shay muttered. She looked at him, knowing that he have something else in mind. Go on, she said. Look at it this way, Shay said, you told me that the last time someone attacked during the goddess rite of rebirth is the Western Church whose main purpose is to retrieve Saint Cyro's body, but you also told me that those who slithers in the dark used the Western Church to manipulate them in order to retrieve the sword of the Creator, right? He asked. She nods. So, what if they are preparing this spell knowing that they will be able to retrieve not one hero's relic but all of them in this day, Shay said. Oh, she said, realizing what Shay is saying, but no one but the descendants of the 10 elites plus Maurice knows about the significance of the ceremony this year, she said, unless, she said as she realized something horrible. Yes, Shay said, someone among the entourage of the descendants is a rat or worst, an impostor, he said. And our excursion to Faergus during Garland Moon is their chance to prepare this huge spell, she said. That's right, Shay said, but this type of spell, he said. Any idea what is it? She asked. None, but I find that it's weird that they can maintain stability from such a huge spell, Shay said. Go on, she said. A huge scale spell such as this must have been hard to maintain even with any support from outside conductors, which meant that there is a tool of sort that is supporting this spell, Shay said. So, in other words, she said, there is a tool of sort hiding around here, one they don't want us to find, and the main source of this spell, she said. Shay nods. Suthies? Arvel? She called out for confirmation of their theory. I say it's worth a try, Suthies said. Yeah, Arvel seconded, since we have no time to plan and figure out what they are doing unlike the other two we've faced so far, and I advise caution as well, he said. Both of them nods in agreement. All right, Shay said as he readied himself and held out his hand to her. What? She asked as she looked at him with a raised eyebrow. Aren't we going there now? Shay asked. No, she said. What? Shay exclaimed, you do know that it's dangerous to face someone we have no information about, right? He asked. And that's exactly why I don't want to take you to a fight blindly, she said. What if the enemy were to hit you with something that the ring of Andovri cannot repel, or something you cannot dodge? She asked, or you might stand between me and an attack again. She added in her mind before Shay's tattered and beaten body being thrown at her feet flashes through her mind again. That traumatized her a lot, and she don't want to see him hurt anymore, and she promised to herself that she will do everything in her power to protect him. She saw Shay clenching his fist with a look of anguish in his eyes, and she knows, just as she swore to herself to protect him, he have swore the same thing towards her as well, and nothing can make happier than that thought. Though, she said, I don't have the same sensitivity to spell as you have with it, she said. The reason why I don't want to take you to face the enemy just yet is because I want you to find the source of their power and destroy it for me, she said, and I'll act as distraction while you go and work on it, she said. That's right, Suthies said. It would be foolish to go at them at the same time without even knowing what this spell can do, she said, so, we'll act as a distraction and avert their attention from you, Suthies said, and I advise caution as well. I can feel another Agarthan other than those here, dangerous and menacing than them, she said. Yeah, the presence feels familiar somehow, as though I know it somewhere before, but no. Arvel said, I can be mistaken and I wish I'm, he said. Do you have something on the other Agarthan, Arvel? Shay asked. I'm not sure, but the last time I felt this dangerous and menacing feeling is when I was the commander of an organization during the War of Lilies, Arvel said. Back when I declare war upon Great Adrestia, he said. Are you saying that it's, Suthies said, weirdly fearful. Yes, Arvel said, and I hope I'm wrong about this one, or we will be in peril if ever, he said. An organization, she asked. In Agartha again? Shay asked. We'll explain later, but for now, focus on the task at hand, Arvel said. All right, Shay said before turning to her. Then, I'll be off, he said, and be careful out there, Your Grace, Shay said. I will, she said, and take care of yourself out there, all right, she said. No worries, Shay said. I won't let anyone kill me before I can even help you, he said. I trust you not to be killed then, she said. Oh, and, Your Grace, Shay said. What? She asked. If I did well, Shay said with a smile. May I ask you for a reward, my lady? He asked teasingly. A reward? She asked. Yeah, Shay said. You know, when a knight did well in protecting his lady, they're bound to be a bountiful reward afterwards, just like the ones I read in books, he said with a soft chuckle and a thoughtful scratch of his cheek. A reward just like the ones the ladies gave to the knights in the stories, she thought. If I can recall from all the novels I was reading for research, that is usually a, she thought before she promptly felt her cheeks heating up. A kiss, she thought as she looked at Shay. But why is he asking me that? She thought. She felt her heart rapidly beating. Unless, she thought, may I dare hope that he felt the same as me? She thought. I mean, why else would he want to be with me? Why else would he put himself in danger when he is facing an unknown enemy, when he can just leave and let me fight alone while he do nothing but stand here and wait for me? She thought, he is doing this for me, she thought, and we can continue where we left off from earlier and swear by each other and seal it with a kiss. She thought before she realized where her thoughts is heading towards. Shut up, she exclaimed, surprising Shay. What? Shay asked. How could you ask for one even before we even started yet? She asked, trying to calm herself down. Calm down, Shay said as he put his hand on her shoulder. I was just teasing, Your Grace, he said gently. Just teasing? She asked, rather surprised. I was trying to lighten the mood before battle, Shay said, you know, to raise morale or something. That's how Captain Berlin usually do it back then, he said. That's almost cruel, she muttered. I'm sorry for asking. Some sort of a pastry for a reward, Shay said. Just a pastry? She asked, laughing softly and feeling silly all of a sudden. Of course, a pastry, she muttered. You wouldn't ask something like that as a return even if it cost you your life, she mumbled. I'm sorry if I offended you, Shay said. No, I just, she said before letting a sigh. I was just surprised, she said. Did I make you feel better by that? Shay asked. Yes, she said. Well, then, Shay said before turning around. I'll see you later, Your Grace, he said before he left. She shook her head and hit her palm against her cheek as soon as Shay is out of sight. Ready, Suthies? Asked. Of course, she said as the celestial robe appeared and she jumped off towards the direction of the two Agarthan. She landed on one of the roofs of the houses below Garagmok just as she saw two figures standing opposite of her on another roof. One dressed as a Gremmery and another as a Death Knight and holding a spear over his shoulder. So it begins, the Goddess Rite of Rebirth. Chapter 38, The Goddess Rite of Rebirth 3. Greetings, Your Grace, the woman said with a curtsy. Let me introduce myself to you, she said. Consider it an honor coming from a much superior races than you, Archbishop of the Heretics, the woman said. Speak, she said as she fight the urge to scoff. I'm Bias, one of the 10 sages of New Agartha, Bias said, and this here is a fellow sage of mine, Anaximandros, she said. And who might you be? She asked. Bilathisner, the vessel of the progenitor god and the Archbishop of the Church of Syros, she said. The Fellstar and her slave, Bias said. What an old name to come happen again, she said. This people, she thought as she looked at the duo, are not like those who we encountered so far, she Thought looking towards the pendant on hanging around her neck. At the very least those we encounter so far have a degree of respect towards Suthies, but these two, sounds disdainful of Suthies, she noted. What? Bias? Asked tauntingly. Cat got your tongue, Archbishop of the Heretics? She asked. She stayed her tongue. These two are no worth of her words more than any scum she ever met. What a boring woman, Bias said with a disappointed sigh. I was hoping to expose your vulgar and uncouth nature and draw your screams of anguish out from that pretty mouth of yours while we defile your so-called holy dignity, she said. She merely stared blankly to them, challenging them to do their worst. It seems like you don't want to give me the satisfaction, Bias said disappointedly. Oh, well, she said before she turned her away. Anaximandros, she is all yours, Bias said. Hell yeah. Anaximandros said, I have always wanted to know what an archbishop tastes like, he said. Syros was rescued from my grasp before I can defile her, Anaximandros said, but the granddaughter might have to do, he said before chains shot out from the grounds and the sky. She was almost caught off guard by it, but she managed to jump away from the chains before she swung her sword to cut away the next bunch that was coming after her, and when she saw the opportunity for her to go after the two, she took it. Yes, again, Bias said as another chain appeared below them. The chain effectively bound her hand before another one bound her other one and another, bounding her neck, and several more, bounding her torso and her legs, making it unable for her to escape. I got you now, Anaximandros said as he comes barreling towards her with his spear and ready to tear either at her dress or at her skin. And she is not about to find out which one. A burst of flames managed to shot away some of the chains binding her, and barely enough for her to block Anaximandros' spear as the flames spread throughout the rest of the chain, freeing her. Oh. Anaximandros said amusedly, you think you are better than me because you are the false goddess vessel? He asked, how about you take a piece of humble peace and just lay down and let me defile you? Anaximandros said before patterns and runes appeared on the spear. She suddenly felt several painful cuts all over her and blood flowing down her open wounds. What? She thought as she kicked Anaximandros away as she threw herself a bit further from Anaximandros to a safe distance between her and that sick pervert. She landed safely on the opposite side of him. I blocked it, yet it managed to cut me, she thought as she looked at the small cuts on her arms and on her sides. The cuts are small, but too many will prove to be fatal. Better be careful and find a way to disarm this disgusting pervert of that weapon, she thought. I see that you are curious about my mighty spear, Anaximandros said with a sick grin on his face. It made her sick to her stomach. This here is called Gibalg, Anaximandros said. A spear made by the master smith Kilain, he said, made from the bones of Kuruid, who was killed while battling against another monster, Anaximandros said, and I obtained it after I slain Kilain in battle during the Zonado massacre and during his futile attempt to defend the Fell Star while she slum bears, Anaximandros boasted. A fitting trophy, no, he said as he admired the intricate and beautiful metal work of the spear. Both beautiful and dangerous. She scoffed lightly, fighting back the urge to state that the man only won is because Nemesis is there and that Suthies is asleep during the whole chaos in Zonado. Impressed yet, Your Grace? Anaximandros asked. This spear can cut anything and everything, even the strongest and mightiest of armors known to man, Anaximandros said as he dashed forward her. She dodged the attack, avoiding as much contact with the blade as physically possible, but to her surprise, pain shot out on her cheek and she felt blood flowing down on it as she received yet another wound from the spear. I never even made contact with it yet, she thought. He did say that it once belonged to my guard Kilain, right? Suthies asked. You know something, Suthies? She asked as she dodged out of the spear's way. The spear hit the ground where she was standing, leaving a huge dent on it as it embedded itself in it. That spear's ability is reliant to either physical contact or by air contact, Suthies said. Also, Suthies said dreadfully. I'm not sure whether I like that tone of yours, Suthies, she said as she made a wrong move of dodging the slash of the spear. sending a very light breeze that she is even hard-pressed to call it a breeze towards her before a light wound appeared on her chest, making her flinched as she felt it across the skin of her bosoms. Anaximandros whistled at the light show of the skin of her chest. "Now, that's what I want to see, Your Grace," he said as he eyed her lustfully. "Suthies, any helpful tips?" she asked as she starts to squirm uncomfortably under the lustful gaze of that man. "This feels unpleasant, the way he is looking at me makes me feel sick, I don't like it," she thought. "None, Suthies said. "The only way you can stop him from wounding you is by disarming him," she said. "Easier said than done," she said before her eyes caught sight of Bias. The woman keeps glaring at her, and the way she managed to garner that disgusting pervert's intention towards her, as though Bias is telling her to be grateful of Anaximandros' lust towards her. "Don't go and be furious at me when it's your man who is the one who decided to turn his otherwise disgusting intention to me. I don't find it flattering one bit, because I only want one man to have those type of intentions towards me, and he doesn't even see me as such," she thought as she fumed a bit at the thought of Shay not even having any thoughts that leads to any of that kind of intentions. "Anyway, I'll worry about that later," she thought as she stayed her ground. "I need to defeat these two first, then I'll worry about Shay and his otherwise too pure intentions towards me," she thought. Meanwhile, he runs through the gates of the monastery, leading him towards the town below Garag Mach. He figured that he best not to use any of his powers lest he risk detection, and that would defeat the whole purpose of acting as Byleth's agent in regards of detecting some of the much harder spells to detect. He hid behind one of the walls of the houses and instantly heaved out a very long sigh. "A dangerous enemy that have some unknown power," he muttered under his breath. "And yet, here I'm crawling about like a rat while Byleth fight those two. Maybe I really am useless to her, and here I'm trying to look cool in front of her," he muttered with a bitter smile. Why else would Byleth order him to find a tool that possible doesn't exist while she fight the enemy by herself? Was it because she thought that he would only be in her way, or? He immediately shakes his head to rid himself of those thoughts. "Now is not the time to doubt Byleth and myself," he muttered. "No heroics and no reckless action, just do what I can do to help her and we'll go from there," he said. "Now, where to look?" he muttered. "Try sensing the flow of the source," Arvel said, "and see what you managed to fish out of that," he said. "Right," he said with a nod, "a source of magic somewhere around here, but I don't seem to sense anything. No. It's faint, but I know it's there, and that's where I'm going," he thought as he runs towards the source of that faint source of magic. Both Raphael and Agants sat before Ethra and earnestly monitor any movements, any activation of magic, anything that will indicate that Valerie is alright. "I hope Big Sis is alright," Ignatz said as he kept a close eye over Ethra. "She will be," Raphael assured Ignatz. "This is Miss Valerie we are talking about," he said. "Of course she is alright," Raphael said. "Such confidence, Valerie said from behind them. "I believe that you two have been putting some mighty high expectations on me," she said as she sat down before Ethra. "But how?" Ignatz asked as he looked over Ethra and back at Valerie. "We didn't even see you going back here," he said. "I hid my presence in order to escape the old bastard," Valerie said, "and so, I will monitor things from here on out," she said before she turned her eyes towards Ethra. "Interesting," Valerie said. "It's like the whole area around Okama Mountain have been severed from the world by those chains," Ignatz said as he eyed the chains surrounding and enveloping the whole of Okama Mountain. "It's a type of distortion spell," Valerie said. "Nothing as great as the Archbishop's divine pulse," she said. "That one is a beast of a spell fitting for the vessel of the progenitor god of Fodlan," Valerie said. "Divine pulse?" Raphael asked. "You went to war with her as your commander, yet you didn't even know that your former professor can turn back time in order to keep all of you alive," Valerie said amusedly. "She can do that?" Ignatz asked incredulously. "That's our professor for you," Raphael said proudly. "But in this fight, the divine pulse would do her better more than a stick would be, since the spell seems to prevent another spell such as that divine pulse of hers," Valerie said. "I thought only us that hail from old Agartha knows how to counter Lady Suthi's spell," she said. "When we find a solution," Raphael said, "will you help the professor fight?" he asked. This is the midget's fight, Valerie said. I have no intention of fighting enemies that can potentially kill me, she said. Just how strong are they? Raphael asked. The two other can't compete with the scavenger of life, but they are on par with he who engulfed all in darkness, Valerie said. Those two are the ones who is fighting the Archbishop now, but the one I just managed to escape now is stronger than those three combines, Valerie said. Both Raphael and Ignatz froze at that. So, I'll just monitor things here for now, Valerie said. Then, you'll go and help Professor as soon as you figure it out, right? Ignatz said in expectation. Valerie flinched at Ignatz's expectation. Something about the unrealistic expectations he and Raphael had in her cuts deeply at her. Not when she decidedly become a coward now. Don't go putting high and lofty expectations on me, she thought. Well, it ain't their fault since you have already showed your cool side to them, the strong and undaunted Miss Valerie. She gave a sigh as she heard her conscience again. All right, Valerie said as she stands up. I'll see what I can do, she said. Ignatz and Raphael smiled proudly at her. And we'll do our best to help you, big sister, Ignatz said. We'll be your eyes here and support you, Raphael said. Say, big sister, Ignatz said as he kept his eyes glued. There is someone moving around, he said. Tell me where, Valerie said. Near one of the inns below Garagmach, and it appears to heading towards the marketplace, Raphael said. Guess the Archbishop's lover have been making an effort to aid her in battle, Valerie muttered. I expect as much, she said as she disappeared. Chapter 39, The Chains of the Labyrinth. Blood splattered across pavement as she managed to block the spear again, sending some sort of invisible blade across her skin. Gah, she thought as she flinched slightly, feeling warm blood flowing down from another wound that have christened her skin. At this rate, I'll faint even before I can disarm him, she thought as she threw Anaximandros off her. I need something and I need it now, she thought urgently. No escape, Bias said before several chains came down from the sky in an attempt to recapture them in their grasp. She jumps backward from the chain before another sprout from the grounds, making her jump up with it as leverage, throwing her higher than she expected, and Anaximandros is right in front of her again, which surprised her. I got you now, Archbishop, Anaximandros said maniacally before he brought down Gibalg down on her. She kicked Anaximandros on the stomach, using it as leverage to dodge his attack, and she barely made it out of his range when she managed to throw herself away from Anaximandros while using him as leverage. She adjusted to the right angle as she jumped up the wall in her escape from those chains. They are stronger than I thought, she thought as she made the Sword of the Creator assume its whip form before swinging it, using it as a grappling hook to give herself a boost up. She felt the chains barely managing to wrap themselves on her ankle before she pulled herself up using the Sword of the Creator. It seems like we underestimated them, Suthis said. Not entirely, she thought as she cut down a chain before several others appeared, towering over her. All we have to do is study them, she said as she jumped up, only to be greeted by Bias, who already signaled a single chain to attack her as soon as she emerged from the forest of chains, hitting her on the stomach. How can they move so fast? She thought as she forced herself to recover. Maybe it's the ability of this spell, Suthis said. A type of distortion spell, she asked as she dodged Anaximandros' attack. That may be it, Suthis said, but this is too peculiar, she said. She nods as she continued to run from the two. And where do you think you are going? Bias asked as she managed to gather that she is back to where she was earlier. What is going on? She thought as she ran away as soon as the chains heading her way. No escape for you. In this labyrinth, I'm God, she announced, so do your best to please and satisfy Anaximandros, your grace, Bias said with a bitter and angry smile. She jumped upward to the top of the bell tower of one of the chapel before the chains started to surround her again, looming over her just like an oppressive warden reminding her of her place in this world Bias claimed to rule over. Anaximandros landed in front of her with a huge grin on his face. Right where I want you, he said, I hope you make this worth my while, Anaximandros. Said as he licked his lips, let's see how should I take you, where to take you, Anaximandros. Said with a shiver, oh, the possibilities. He said happily. Why be stubborn and resist, Archbishop? Bias asked as she stood on the wall of chains, why not just lay down, spread your legs, and let Anaximandros do whatever he want with you and maybe he can be merciful on you when he cuts you down once he is satisfied. She asked with a hint of anger. Because I want to live and oh, I don't know, she thought, I want it to happen with someone I'm in love with. She thought as she steeled herself before she felt Shay's presence focus, don't let them know that Shay is here. Grab their attention and hope for the best, she thought as she calmed her mind, focus on killing what is front of you, focus on killing him, kill him in one strike. She thought as she relaxes her stance. Finally giving up. Bias asked cockily. Anaximandros smiled lustfully as he charged towards her, eager and ready to help himself to her. Right, she muttered as her power flared to life. She swung the sword of the Creator, white fire enveloping the blade and extending it to an even longer height as she swung it in a circular movement, effectively engulfing everything in flame. Anaximandros managed to jump back from her just as she swung her blade, catching him in surprise before she raised her sword and made it assumed its whip form and brought it down towards Anaximandros, which he managed to jump back from, but the shockwave of the sword of the Creator hitting the ground made flames sprout from the ground, instantly engulfing Anaximandros into their infernal embrace. No, Anaximandros! Bias screeched as she saw Anaximandros' charred corpse on the ground. The next one then! She thought as she come charging to Bias, who is still screeching in horror at Anaximandros' demise. She close to Bias before. My, Anaximandros! Said as he grabs hold of her wrist, stopping her in her track as they come face to one another. You are certainly strong, Archbishop, he said, and I like them feisty, Anaximandros said, face burnt. Get away from him. Suthies shouted urgently. This brought her out of her shock and promptly stomped the man's face before jumping away from him with the help of the flames that burst out of her feet. Yes, Anaximandros growled in pleasure, definitely a feisty one, he said, you would prove to be a worthy conquest that I can brag about for centuries to come, Anaximandros said. She watched in horror as Anaximandros begun to regenerate. His skin, his face, everything. His regeneration is too fast, she said as Anaximandros finished healing himself and in full armor once more. That seems impossible, Suthies said, aside from you who is my vessel, no one should have this type of regeneration, she said. Did something just activated? She thought as she took note of something she felt when the flames burned Anaximandros to crisp. So, you felt it too, huh? Suthies said. Yeah, it's like there is some kind of transfer that transpired when Anaximandros died, she said, using these chains as a way to transport supply to Anaximandros and help him regenerate. She said, they gather a life force from somewhere and they have instant access to it too, she said. I don't think she can do this complex spell alone, there must some sort of trick behind this spell of hers, she said. How dare you, Bias said in rage, to harm Anaximandros when you should be thankful to even be receiving his attention, you whore, she said. I don't even want it, bitch, she thought. You even stomped his beautiful face. I won't let you out of this with just a stab wound, Bias said. I'll make sure that I'll ruin that pretty face of yours, she said. Did you see that, Bias? Anaximandros asked. A strong and feisty woman, he said. Just the way I like em, Anaximandros said with a lick of his lips. I'll capture her in a minute and you can have your disgusting fun with her before we head over the monastery and kill all of those within it. Just wait a moment, Bias said. It's going to be an endless fight if I were to be entangled with them here, she thought. I better think of a plan before they exhaust me to death, she thought. To the southeast, the opposite side of the monastery is where I felt that activation and that's where their power supply is, she thought, that's probably the trick behind her spell, she thought as she looked to the side, and that's where Shay is heading, the same place where I'm heading, she thought as she relaxed at the thought of Shay. I might drag him into a fight again, but, she thought before smiling to herself, if he is there, if only he is there, she thought, knowing that is enough for me, she thought. He stopped dead in his track as he felt a sudden burst of power from the direction opposite him. Byleth just released a huge amount of power just now, he thought before he tried to tune into that feeling again. She defeated one of them. He thought before he felt another burst of power, a different one. That is, what was that? He muttered as he felt the other enemy come back to life. Wait, I felt that large burst of power poured into that other person, he muttered. That burst of power comes from the place near Byleth, and from where they draw it from comes from, he muttered as he turned around to the direction where he felt that burst of power from. It's somewhere far from Byleth and somewhere near this area, he muttered. It is the tool that is maintaining this spell, he muttered. If so, then it is bound to be guarded by something or someone, he said. I better be careful, he muttered before running towards the direction of the source. I hope nothing shows up before I can even destroy it, he thought as he draws his sword. When he arrived at the location, he saw a whole house burst into a purple light before disappearing. Now, that is weird, he thought at the vacant lot. I could have sworn I felt another transfer despite the owner of this spell being unharmed. No, it's more like it moved somewhere as soon as its host disappeared, he thought. Was it being transferred to another host too, just as it transformed the power towards that dead Agar then? He thought, and he is so lost in thought that he didn't sense someone sneaking up on him until a hand grabs his armor. He barely have time to scream before the hand pulled him back to the dark alley. You are boring, Bias said as she looked down on her while she dodged flurry after flurry of chains coming after her. Why don't you talk more like your kind used to, she said. But I guess you take a lot from your grandmother, dearest, Bias said in disgust. Never talked about revenge and never rushed headlong to battle despite the rage she is feeling, Bias said. How boring can your family gets? Bias asked with a sigh. She flinched as a chain hit her hard on her face. Indeed, she thought as she jumped away from another chain that is targeting her abdomen before wiping the blood from the corner of her mouth. They are standing between me and the source of their power over there, she thought as she barely dodged Anaximandro's attack, which tore her dress horizontally, only stopping on her stomach, exposing her chest and barely covering her bosoms and stomach before blood burst from her chest as the spear opened another wound on her. Do they want to keep me away from there? She thought as Anaximandros went back to Bias' side. Not bad, Archbishop, Anaximandros said with a sick grin as he watched blood flow down her chest to her stomach, tainting her skin red. Hey, when can I have my turn on her, Bias? Anaximandros asked. I want them now, he demanded. Aren't you a bossy one for someone who is asking such a hard task, Anaximandros, Bias said with a grimace. Well, I ain't have a woman in days and you know how painful that is for me, Anaximandros said. Well, I already lost interest with this mute of a woman anyways, Bias said. Guess, I'll end it with this, she said as the chains shot upward once more in preparation to attack her, towering over her once more. She looked up. Looking at it now, I can already guess the pattern of their movements as well as their range, and obviously, those two are underestimating me for my poor defensive movement, she thought as she continued to analyze the situation to find a way to beat the enemy before her. Now, be a good little plaything for us and just behave, Bias said as the chains went down on her and the chapel, crushing everything underneath its weight. Bias smiled smugly at the thought of finally getting rid of one of Anaximandros' potential conquest before it promptly disappeared as a flash of white fire shot out from Rubbles and Chain. You know why I don't talk to you? She asked as the flaming wings flaps, making the pure white flaming feathers rain around her as though it was a bunch of fiery snow before she shot past them with the sword of the Creator at the ready as flames covered it, ready to deliver the goddess judgment upon these apostate. It's because you two are disgusting, she said as she flew towards the source of their power. That is, she muttered to herself as she saw a giant box with several chains wrapping itself around it, unfold Suthi's power, just like back when she manifested into this world during Great Tree Moon, unfold the fraction of that power and, she thought as she managed to grasp a huge amount of Suthi's power and the flames that is engulfing the sword of the Creator flared brighter to life, destroy it in one shot. She shouted as the sword of the Creator shot out a stream of giant white flames towards the box, engulfing it into its fiery embrace. The chains squirmed around as though they are in pain before the white inferno died down and nothing left of whatever that is, only the charred grounds below. Did I destroy it? She muttered as she panted in exhaustion. That one shot took a lot from her and she felt weak. Not yet, Byleth. Suthies shouted as a magic circle appeared on the ground where the box once stood. A trap. She exclaimed in surprise. Checkmate, Bias said as she appeared behind her. Your Grace, she added. When did you dash? She exclaimed. And with that a flash of light burst out from the magic circle, activating a spell and engulfing everything its blinding embrace. What the hell is that? He thought in fear as a giant box sprouted from grounds along with a lot of chains wrapping themselves around the box, and he can only watch horror as it came towards him, all the while he is struggling to get out of the hand's tight grip on his armor. I'm going to be killed here. He thought in horror as the chains shot towards him. She looked at the chains binding her to the ground. What the hell is this? She muttered as she tried to move, only for the chains to forcefully lift her by her bounded hand and off the ground, making her flinched in pain. Now, Bias said with a wicked smile, I have you right where I want you, she said as Anaximandros landed in between them with a lustful smile. Chapter 40, The Chains of the Labyrinth 2. She tried to struggle against the chains bounding her hands together again, but to no avail. No use trying to escape, Archbishop, Bias said as she sat down on the throne made by the chains. Those chains won't let go of their prey once they have them in its grasp, but just to make sure, Bias said as a chain shot up and hit her on the stomach. She recoiled in pain and barely managed to prevent the scream of pain that is threatening to come out of her mouth before another chain hit her on the back. Oh, another one, Bias said with a giggle. I must have forgotten that one, she said. Hey, Bias, Anaximandros said, how about letting me have a go at her, he said. Now, Anaximandros demanded. How impatient can you get? Bias asked with a sigh. Can't you see how obstinate she looks? Bias asked as she looks at her. She doesn't look like she is about to let go of the sword or let you near her anytime soon, she said. As soon as Bias said that, she can feel the chains tightening itself around her wrist, which made her held onto the sword of the Creator even harder. The pain is becoming overbearing as she tightened her hold on the sword, which is only making the chains tighten themselves around her wrist. My, aren't you a hard worker? Bias asked with a condescending smile. Holding onto that blade and protecting your great-grandmother's bones, she said. Such a lovely gesture for your beloved great-grandmama, Bias said. Say, Anaximandros, she said. What? Anaximandros asked impatiently. How about speeding up the process and cut her hands instead? Bias asked. I'm sure that you can fuck a handless woman, she said. She won't be using her hands anyway, Anaximandros said with a shrug of his broad shoulders. Well, it seems like your hands have to go, Your Grace, Bias said as she is about to raise her hand to order the chains to rip her hands off their sockets. Before that can happen, she let go of the sword of the Creator and let it fall onto the ground. This seems to surprise both Anaximandros and Bias, since they must have been expecting a more fierce fight from her, but her surprising compliance to them certainly took them by surprise. Byleth's face flashed through his mind as he watched in horror as the chain shot out towards him. Byleth, he called out in hopes that she will come running to his side, at the very least to have a final glance at her visage before he die. Have anyone told you that it was rude to call out to another woman while another is holding you in her arms, runt? Valerie asked. Miss Valerie, he said, surprised to see the older woman. What are you doing here? She asked as she jumped to a roof. Don't you know that it's dangerous here? She asked. Well, I was looking for that, he said, looking over to the newly formed giant box. Valerie looked around for a while. Let's Go somewhere safe, that troublesome guy might be around, she said before jumping to another roof with him in tow. What? Valerie exclaimed as soon as he finished explaining what he is doing there. You managed to find that even before it manifested? She asked in shock. Well, I was able to sense the transfer of power from one source into another, but it was after Her Grace have destroyed the source of their power, he said. But I might be wrong about that, he said. No, you are right, just not on the location of the tool that is supporting this spell, Arvel said. I guess so, he said, but I can't pinpoint the exact location of the tool, but I know it is in here somewhere, he said. Maybe that box and chains are doing something to my senses, he muttered. Valerie blinked in surprise. Go on, she said. Are you thinking of how there is more of those hosts scattered around the whole of Okamamudin? Arvel asked. It only makes sense that they have these hosts scattered around the Okama mountain, he said. But why? Arvel asked. As an emergency ration in case that they are severely wounded in battle, he said, and to hide the tool's real location, since that tool is the one who is the main factor of this spell and one who is maintaining such a huge spell, he said. So, you suggest that we cut off their supply in hopes of weakening the distortion spell and the enemies? Valerie asked. That's right, he said. That way, Her Grace would have a easier time fighting them and we can end this fight once and for all, he said. No wonder the Archbishop insists on taking you to every battle, Valerie muttered. All right, Runt, she said, turning to him. Let's work up a plan to help your lover out, she said. He can feel his cheeks heating up at that remark. She is my employer, not my lover, he said. Hey, nothing wrong with getting in bed with your employer and give it to her good, since it can be a good boost in your career as a knight, Valerie said with a shrug of her shoulders. I wasn't about to use her like that, he said softly. Byleth is a dear and important friend of mine, he stated. Keep telling that to yourself, Runt, Valerie said, but everyone can see that the Archbishop is more than willing to drag you to her bed herself and do the nasties with you if she have the galls to even do it, she said. I guess you are too precious to her to even force herself on you, but, Valerie said. What? He asked. Nobody can tell, especially since her love is still unrequited, Valerie said, and since she is also half Nabatean, then it's all the more she is unpredictable, since Nabateans is known as creatures of absolute attachments, and once they set their hearts to someone, nothing and no one can sway them to change their minds and their hearts, and they will remain loyal to that person to the very end of their lives, Valerie said, remembering Suthies and her beloved husband, Lord Anubis, and they will do whatever it takes to have that person for themselves, since it's part of their nature to do so, Valerie said. What's that supposed to mean? He asked. Figure it out yourself, Runt, Valerie said with a giggle, but right now, we have to think of a plan to figure out how to beat those two, she said. Now, I have you right where I want you, Your Grace, Anaximandros said as he let go Gibalg before he started approaching her, unclasping each of his armor as he neared her. She tried to struggle against the chains again before it tightened even more on her wrist, making her stop moving. Now, Your Grace, Anaximandros said as his hands inched closer and closer to her, making her grimace. Aren't you forgetting something, you ungrateful cur? Bias asked. Anaximandros clicked his tongue as he stopped his unwanted advance to her. Can it wait until I'm finished with her? He asked. You promised me a reward upon capturing your latest conquest, Bias said, and here I thought you are a man of your words, Anaximandros, she said. Anaximandros sighed. I guess a warm-up before I move on to you is a good thing, he said, since I know that it will take a while before I tire of you, Anaximandros said as he ran his finger down on the bare skin of her chest to her stomach, sending an unpleasant and fearful shiver down her spine. All right, he said before turning around to face Bias, who raised from her seat from her steel throne. As you wish, he said as he walks towards her. She watched as Bias wrapped her arms around Anaximandros before pulling him down to meet his lips with hers. A kiss is a sacred and most obvious sign of affection, kissing someone on the cheek is a sign of closeness to that person, but a kiss on the lips is a sign of oath, Manuela said. What are they doing? She thought. An oath? She asked. Yes, why do you think people kissed after taking their vow to one another during a wedding ceremony? Manuela asked. That kiss along with their words of vows of love to one another is just another way of saying that they are taking an oath of their love for all times. That other person is allowed to come closer to them and to give themselves to one another, she said. That's why a kiss is not something you can give to just about anybody. It's something solely belongs to the one you want to exchange oaths with, Manuela said. Bias pushed Anaximandros to sit on her throne just as she saw her dipping her hand inside the man's breeches, fishing out his unmentionable before she sat on his lap as she continued kissing Anaximandros. I feel sick, this is wrong, what they are doing is wrong. She thought in disgust as she watched them do their dirty business in front of her. So, they are really after those heroes' relics, he said as he clung onto Valerie. I don't know much about those newbies, but it seems like they are trying to get rid of the remaining Nabateans, she said. They seems to be following the so-called will of yours, Epimens, Valerie said. I can't even recall when did my initial plans involving Suthi's change or weenie feelings towards her change from love to hatred, Arvel said. I found it weird too, Valerie said. You used to speak of Lady Suthi's as though she is your whole universe, but during the War of the Hero, you seem to take a rather different approach, she said. Must be that wretched Thales of Miletus, Arvel said. Must have changed my original coding for something else, he said. Might be, Valerie said. So, those two are your subordinate too, Arvel? He asked. Heavens no. Arvel said. I would never ally myself with those ingrates who knew nothing of what they want for the future of Fodlan, and they just do what they pleases and destroying lives after lives of innocent bystanders without even thinking of the consequences. Being associated with them is more embarrassing than being killed in the battlefield, because you are distracted by a girl's bloomer, Arvel said. Something that happened to someone you know? He asked. Valerie just giggled at that. Almost, but that's a story for another time, Arvel said. You can always ask Suthi's since it kinda involved the Fisher Dragon, Valerie said. Okay, which way, Runt? Valerie asked. Take a left over there and you will see a tavern, he said. Got it, Valerie said. He tightened his hold Valerie as she jumped up. My, what would the Archbishop think if she ever knows that you held me in your arms, Runt? Valerie asked. I wasn't. He retorted. She might end little Helen if she ever found the absolute infidelity you have committed here, Arvel said. And you'll help me hide it, Arvel? He exclaimed as they landed on the building. I'm sworn to be honesty, Circe, Arvel said. That meant I won't anything towards the Archbishop, that meant this will come to light, Arvel said with a chuckle. Well, tell her. He said, crossing his arms over his chest with a haughty huff. We are not really together anyway, he said. That won't matter with someone with a Nabatean blood. She already decided that she pretty much wanted to spend her life with you, that whatever your feelings towards her won't matter. She'll find a way to make you hers one way or another, Valerie said. Hey, do you copy? She asked to someone. We hear you, Miss Valerie. The tavern, someone said. Make sure you two remember the exact locations of each of those hosts or else, Valerie said. Understood, big sister, another one said. All right, next, Valerie said as she jumped up. I have to do my best, in order to help Byleth, he thought as they jumped from building to building. Just wait for a moment, Byleth, he thought. I'll be there soon, he thought as he felt another one. She heard Bias let out a moan before she saw her slowly stopping. Oh, right, Bias said as she got off Anaximandros' lap and quickly fixed herself as she faced her. I seem to recall that you called us disgusting earlier, Bias said as a chain hit her on her cheek. She bit her tongue a little to prevent the pained groan from escaping her lips. Don't you know how much time I actually have to waste to prepare labyrinth for you? Bias Asked with a sigh, the least you can do as a thank you is to entertain me and Anaximandros, but you got caught by the first trap I laid out and capture you this easily, Bias. Said mockingly, surely, the rumors sells you too much and they definitely exaggerated you, your grace, she said. She glared at Bias at that. I really hate those eyes of yours, Bias. Said, why don't you talk more? She asked with a grin on her face. Tell us how you will destroy us. Tell us how you are going to bring forth the vengeance of your kind, she said, but she is met with nothing but silence, nothing at all. Bias asked, or you'd rather say something else? She asked, and she was met by a glare. Then, by all means, talk, Bias said with a wave of her hand. You are doing it wrong, she said. Bias hummed in annoyance at that. Well, you can have your own opinion and I'll have mine, she said. If giving Anaximandros what he wants would make him happy, then I shall, Bias said as she grabs Anaximandros and caressed his cheek, all the while looking up at him like he was the very image of her happiness. And if he is happy, then I'm as well, Bias said softly as she pulled Anaximandros down. What does a tool of destruction such as yourself knows about love when all you ever known in life is how to destroy and how to take? She asked before she locked lips with Anaximandros again. She watched in disgust again. When Shay and I finally arrived at this, she thought, as the two continue, will we be like this too? She thought, no. Being together is not like this is not what it is, she thought as Bias' hands started to wander around Anaximandros' body. I'll work hard to be strong, so that I can be with you. Would that mean that we'll always be together forever? Shay, she thought as his face appeared in her mind. The smiling face she loves so much, his determined eyes that always assured her that everything will be alright, and his gentleness that always made her feel like she is more than the archbishop or the tool of destruction like these Agarthans thought of her. Are you staying with me now? She thought. Yes, you are indeed wrong, she said. You are just clinging to him, she stated. Bias stopped whatever she is doing to Anaximandros before she turned her with a burning rage reflecting in her eyes. Now, why would you think that? She asked as she grabs the sword of the Creator, when you know nothing about me and him. Bias asked as she poked her on the chest. No, talking to a tool like you about love is useless because you would never understand what love is, Bias said as she slowly thrust the sword of the Creator into her chest. Bringing joy to Anaximandros and protecting him is my everything, she said as she drives the sword further into her chest. What does a tool who knows nothing about love knows? She asked as she twisted the sword into her wound. Being displayed before these perverts and being made a fool, I don't think I can tolerate it any longer, she thought as she gritted her teeth in anger, and she is ready to activate a spell when Bias jolted up in shock. What in the world? This is, she exclaimed. This sign, she thought as she managed to grasp the familiar spell signature. Heracles. Heracles. Bias called out. What got your panties in a bunch? Heracles asked as he lodged on the grass below the chapel on the foot of the mountain. It's that heretic. She is moving around and casting a dispel towards the scattered fragments of my spell, Bias said. I thought we should leave her alone since she isn't even involved in this, Heracles said, and that I should just guard Compassus, he said. Well, things changes now. Get rid of that woman, Bias said. Why not just kill the archbishop and be done with it? Heracles asked. Do you take me for a fool? Let an enemy know the secret of the labyrinth, Bias shouted. I guess, Heracles said a little, he said with a chuckle. Do what you are paid to do, Bias said before the line went dead. Heracles scratched his head as he sat upright. Damn, what a very demanding woman, he said. But, he said as he morphed into a half-demon, half-man, I never expect to enjoy this job this much, Heracles said with a wide grin as his fangs shows, both on his mouth and the mouth on his chest. She chuckled at that. And pray tell, what you find funny? Bias asked. I was just thinking of how I almost become impatient waiting for them, but I guess the waiting isn't that half bad, she said. You are waiting? Half bad? Bias asked in confusion. Being ridiculed, humiliated, and even displayed like this before you two is more than a regular person can take, but I guess it wasn't all that bad knowing that I can buy some time for them, she said. Bias smiled rather happily and cheerfully at her as she gripped the sword of the Creator. Then, Bias said, you can die happy now. She said as she swung the blade towards her. I hope you have a pleasant trip in hell, Archbishop of the Heretics, Bias said with a grin before she noticed something as she looked at the mangled remains of the Archbishop. There goes my fun, Anaximandros said. Why isn't it bleeding? Bias thought as she looked at the corpse closely before it burst into flames. What the Desh, Bias said. My apologies, a familiar voice said from behind them. I didn't mean to use a dirty trick such as this, but, she said. Bias and Anaximandros looked towards the direction of the voice and found the Archbishop a few meters away from them. Everything is fair, right? Byleth asked. When did she? Bias thought as Anaximandros grabs the sword from her and prepared himself for battle. Now, shall we? Byleth asked as they felt a surge of power from her. Check the description for the links to the author.